everybody. Sorry about that. It didn't seem to go on. Um, just wanted to start another lecture. This kind of has to do with the history of the social work profession. I'm in my office, by the way, if you're trying to figure out why there's a flag behind me. So let me just ask this first. Many of you may be wondering about the salaries with social work. I sometimes hear people say that their families told them not to do this because they didn't make any money. So before I get into the history, I want to tell you that that isn't necessarily true. That over the past 10 or 15 years, when social workers started to get licensed in different places, we started to be able to be paid professional salaries, and that has helped a lot. I think we are starting our bachelor's level social workers at like 55 right now. And then there's a lot, it's a union job, so it's got steps up. So other places it might be a little bit lower, government pays a little bit more. Our social workers who've been here say 10 or 15 years are making 80, 85,000, so it's a decent salary. Our directors of departments like in aging or social services or mental health are making anywhere from 110 to 120. So it's not what it used to be. It's much better, and if you end up in private practice, you get your master's, you get your license. You can make as much as any psychologist and whatever the people are willing to pay. I know people who don't use insurance, who are cash-only social workers, and they're making good salaries. So don't let anybody tell you anymore that social workers don't necessarily make money. Even in my position, even though I'm an elected official, I'm making, at this point, as a social worker, right, I'm still making about $100,000. That's a public salary. That's why I can say it to you. You could just look it up. So anyway, I also, people who pick social work, they tend to be people who either are very sensitive to how people feel and they pick up on things. They often have had issues or struggled with things in their life, and they either understand what people have gone through and want to give back because they understand, or because someone helps them, they also want to give it back the way they got it. So one of the reasons you're drawn to this is not just the money. It's that need to do more, to serve, to have that altruistic kind of a job. So, here we are. And as we learned in the last lecture about conflict model versus consensus model, some of us are going to be here to work to change the system to meet the needs of clients. And some of us are going to be working with clients to try to change them to meet the requirements of the system. So, but we're all here together, and some of us do both of everything. So the history of the profession. We start to really hear about social workers in the mid to late 1800s, more in the late 1800s. Think about what was happening in the late 1800s. From the South, slavery had ended and Civil War's over, and we are into Reconstruction. We also have a lot of people moving north. What's happening in the North is there is a lot of industrialization. So people are working less and less like on a farm where the family works it. They are starting to work in factories. As they are able to figure out how to modernize factories, they need more and more people there. So people stop going from living in the home where they go outside on the farm and come in at the end of the day to leaving their home, going into town, working in the factory, and then coming home. It's a different kind of environment that's happening now in the North more and more. At the same time as that's happening, there is a ton of immigration going on. I think if you're reading the Orphan Train, you can see that what's happening with immigration there, at least with the Irish population, also happened with the Italian population. As we move into the 1900s, same thing with the Polish population. Same thing that is happening now was happening then. We have repeated this before. It feels a little bit meaner now, and it's a little bit clearer because we have television and computers and 24-hour news services, so we feel it a lot more than maybe they felt it in the past. So as we have people moving from the South, as we have all this level of immigration coming in, as we have factories, and sometimes they have children working, and we have adults that are working, 60, 70-hour work weeks, we start to see some breaks in society. We start to see kids who are not being fed. We start to see families living in tenement homes. We start to find that there's no plumbing in some of these tenements, that sewage is backing up. And there starts to be a call for someone to fix things. And that's when you start to see the social work profession arriving. a lot of social workers worked with these immigrant families. They would call themselves settlement houses and settlement communities, because the immigrants would come in, they would be living in tenements and everything. They were having language difficulties on top of everything else they're dealing with. So these social work types would come into like a community area of those apartments in the tenements and try to help them get their kids registered for school, help them learn the language, help them to find jobs. They would actually go and advocate, trying to get sewage systems put in, to get garbage pickup to happen. So that's part one of social workers. Part two was that there were well-meaning people out there who had some finances and wanted to be able to give to poor people or people who were struggling, but they needed to know who deserved it, because that's how our country always used to be, who deserved it. So these people called friendly visitors, which were really the precursors to social workers, would interview people, and they would determine whether or not somebody was actually worthy of being given charity or anything like that. So the friendly visitors were the first official social workers. It just emphasizes that thing that, this country has always believed that people need to work hard, and if you're not working hard, we're only going to reward you with a leg up if there's, a real good reason for it. Social workers continue to be important as we move into the early 1900s for another reason. We start to see, as people live longer, more and more mental health, and people who become so mentally ill that they cannot stay in the community and they need to be placed in hospitals. They were called almshouses at the time. We also see tuberculosis is rampant, and people are trying to keep people with tuberculosis also isolated from the community, because it would kill people. So almshouses became the place where people with mental illness or serious physical illness lived. That was a difficult time. We have a couple of those almshouses in Bucks County from those times, and they have a difficult history if you read about what happened to people in there. So going back over it again, I just want to say 1880 to like 1900, those friendly visitors, they are learning what casework is. That's the precursor to social workers, but they were learning casework as they decided whether or not people were deserving of any help they gave them. As we get into 1920, 1930, we have Freud, the psychiatrist, which I'm sure you've all heard of, the father of psychology. As his ideas came about more, social workers started to be used to counsel people who had mental health issues, who would be in those almshouses. So that's an important thing to remember. And as the Depression hits then, that's kind of the next wave. That's when social workers start to move, not just from the psychology part with Freud or the caseworker part from the late 1800s, but they start having to take a real important role in public welfare. So the New Deal passes, Franklin Roosevelt gets Social Security through, he gets welfare as we know it today through, or how it was back then. And now there's a real need to connect people in the communities with these resources, and that becomes a major job of social workers. It isn't given to really any other profession, not to psychologists, not to doctors, not to nurses. So you start seeing professional caseworkers who connect people with services, can provide some counseling. Around 1945, after the World War II, that's when you start to see social workers doing group psychology kind of work. Part of this is because there wasn't that many of them to do the work, and the other part was there were so many people who were coming back from war with so much trauma, so much what today we would call post-traumatic stress disorder, that they couldn't treat them all. So they would treat them in groups. They would treat them at Veterans Administration buildings, and that's when social workers got to be known. Now we have another skill. We can give you casework services, we can refer you how to get Social Security and welfare, but we can also do group therapy kind of things with you. Social work changes a little bit more in the 60s. Assuming that all of you are kind of aware of the 60s and what it was like. It was a turbulent time. Lots and lots of people going to college, women going to college for the first time. So many more jobs were requiring a college degree now, moving from an industrialized nation to one that has computers and has all kinds of systems that require that degree. So when women and men were going away to college, they started to really, look, as people do, think critically about how the country is going. And at the same time, we have the Vietnam War, which turned out to not be the greatest reason for us to have engaged in that war. So students become very active, and they become active with the war, and then they become active with women students who are starting to say, hey, I want a little bit more out of life. I want to be able to apply for my own credit card, not have to have my father or my husband apply for it for me. I want my own checking account. So then they start with women's rights. You have probably heard eventually women in the late 60s, 70s were burning bras as a way of saying that, you're not going to restrict us anymore. Big deal was civil rights. Martin Luther King, the civil rights vote of 1964 to give voting rights, to protect people of color, to be able to not have to have tests in order to be able to vote. All of that is happening, and social workers are critical here because they are the ones that know how to advocate. They've been learning that back since the 1930s, and they've been working with people who were struggling since the 1800s. So they become very active in trying to get more civil rights through. They become active in trying to fight the war, and they get real active with President Johnson had a whole bunch of acts that he tried to put through between 64 and 68 to try to fight poverty. And social workers get very, very involved in all of that. So it was a busy, busy time. And that's kind of when we took our biggest leap in social work, would have been in the 60s. It's also why people will say that we're very liberal, because we were out there fighting for all those liberal causes. And as this class goes on, you'll see that it was in the 70s and on that maybe most of the changes finally started to happen. I will say that from 75-ish to 1990, and this was during the time that I began to practice in the late 80s, what we started to see was social work took on this theory of an ecosystem. So there had been a lot of talk about ecology in the 60s and 70s and making the environment better. It trickled in the 70s, 80s, 90s into what social work did with families. They started trying to look at a family as a system, much like an ecosystem. And if something happens to mom or something happens to a child, it affects everybody else in that system. So a lot of family therapy started to be done between 75 and 90. A lot of in-home visits were made. I did that for years. There was a man at Penn named Mnookin. He used to have families come into an actual clinical environment, and they would stay at the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania in a place where he could observe the family for a few days, and they would try to treat them from there. So, and this was all based on the idea that if one thing happens to one member in the family, it affects another member of the family. From 1990 until today, social workers have continued to work to advocate for different changes. We have worked very hard to get the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, in. They worked extremely hard to get laws changed that would allow for gay marriage, that would allow people from the LGBT community to become foster parents and to adopt. They were very active in the initial gay right marches of 1979. So we've had to do with a lot of stuff that way too. So I think this is important that you know this part too, because I think it's also a question on the test, but there are certain things that you need in order to be considered a profession. This is with any profession. And so for social workers to be considered a true profession, they need these things too. There's 6 things that you have to have. The first thing is you have to have a core base of knowledge. So social work knowledge is a little different than psychologist knowledge, different than teacher knowledge. You have to have that core base. You also have to have certain regulations for members. That means that you'll probably have licenses or some kind of rules that people have to abide by. The third thing is you have to have ethical standards. We'll talk about this in a later module, but the social work profession does have ethical standards. I feel like there's 90 of them, but I can't remember. But we'll get to it then. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. We have a professional organization called the National Association of Social Workers that holds us to those ethical standards. You have to have clients in order to be a profession. So obviously, social workers get clients. There has to be a way to licensure. Being able to have a license means that it is a profession, and we do that. We have testing. And there has to be an exclusivity to the profession, so that teachers can't be social workers can't be electricians. There has to be a specific exclusivity to it. I'm going to just say those quick six again. Core base of knowledge, regulation of its members, a code of ethics, clients, a licensure, and exclusivity of your ability. Columbia University is one of the first universities in 1920 to begin having social work degrees, so they were integral in making sure that we were recognized as a profession. That exclusivity came as a result, quite frankly, of Columbia recognizing that you could get a degree in this. Wondering if anything I've said so far has given you any kind of a different view of social work, or what you thought of it. I know you can't answer me, but just wondering what you're thinking about it right now. Talking about social work values, I have a list here. I don't know how well this is going to come up if I hold it up for you, but it is. I'll also type it in the list. In this module. So these are the core social work values, and I'm going to say them because what I want you to listen for is which of these values might you struggle with. I'll tell you what they are. So there's a respect for diversity, confidentiality. Another ethical standard is non-judgmentalism, professional conduct, ethical conduct. We value letting people have access to resources. We value the dignity and worth of our clients. We believe in self-determination, and basically what that means, we'll talk about it again, but self-determination is that a client should be able to decide what they want to do. Then we respect that. If a client doesn't want our help, or doesn't want to work on a problem, or wants to continue doing a behavior we don't like, we let them do it because of self-determination. And social justice. That means that we have to fight for there to be justice in our system and in the world. So I guess I want you to answer that one. I'll ask this to you probably in the questions. What of those core basic things do you think you would struggle with? I think probably, to be honest with you, one that I sometimes have the biggest trouble with is confidentiality. Not because I want to blab it around or anything like that, but it's difficult because sometimes I want people to understand the problems that other people have. So I just have to be very careful that I don't leave any identifying information with that. So you'll let me know what yours is. Just a couple other things I wanted to say right here is that social work kind of has two things that go on. I may have referred this once or twice before, but we have microservices, mesoservices, and macro. So micro is when we work one-on-one with someone, basically. Macro is when we are out there working to change social justice and change the government and come up with ways to help people to help the system to change its rules and to work better. Meso is in between. That's where you're kind of doing a little bit of social work, but you're also working to change the system. Or you might be a supervisor of social workers, so you're working to help them be able to make the system better, maybe not doing direct client. I am, at this point as a commissioner, I'm a macro social work because I'm trying to change rules and laws and all those kind of things. Okay, I'm going to end this lecture for right now and be back with you soon. Thanks.